We're continuing our walk through the Olivet Discourse, and we're looking at Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse in this episode. Now, we are building upon the work that we've done in not only the previous video about Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, Luke's little apocalypse in chapter 17, but also Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse, Mark chapter 13. We have a playlist. It'll be linked in the video description right down below, so you can catch up on the previous episodes. This is a long-form study. We are taking our time. We're not rushing through it. We're snooping around, digging through, sifting through, kind of like archaeologists, and seeing what is in this text. And not only that, but how different Christians have interpreted this most enigmatic teaching of Jesus's, or at least among the most enigmatic teachings of Jesus. If you appreciate this type of long form teaching, we would love for you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And as all of our teaching videos here on Disciple Dojo, we have disabled mid-roll ads, so you should not see anything pop up and interrupt this session. And so if you appreciate that aspect, you can help us continue to have more long-form teaching without ads by becoming a monthly Dojo donor at whatever dollar amount you think this is worth or you feel led to give. But if you do become a monthly Dojo donor, let me know. Send me an email through our contact form, and I would love to get you one of our patches, either our dark or light color Disciple Dojo patch. I'm happy to send one to you. You just have to shoot me an email and say, hey, I'm a Dojo donor. Here's my address. I don't use that for anything other than to send you one of these patches. All right, let's jump into Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, Luke 21. So as we look at Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, I'm going to be pulling from a number of different commentaries throughout this series, and I have color-coded them partially so I can keep track of who I'm actually citing. But these are the commentaries that I have been using and pulling from in this study. They go all the way back to the 70s with Fitzmyer up to R.T. France's Luke in the Teach the Text commentary series, which came out in 2013. These are from a range of different views. Some are mainline, some are evangelical. Some would hold to Luke being written before 70 AD. Some would say Luke is written after 70 AD. And I will list these again in the video description below. So before commenting, hey, which comment series did you cite? Because I've gotten those comments in the past on previous videos in the series. Just tap on the title of this video if you're watching on your phone, and the video description will pop up and you can see links to anything I mention. They'll probably be there. So go there first before leaving a comment. We're going to jump into Luke chapter 21, and the Olivet Discourse begins in verse 5. Now, in those first 4 verses of Luke 21 is the account of the people giving gifts at the temple, and then the poor widow who comes and just gives 2 small coins. And Jesus says, that's the most valuable of all the gifts. So that's where the Olivet Discourse begins in Luke's gospel. And that's not an unimportant detail. And so verse 5 begins, and again, on the left is the Greek text, and on the right is an extremely literal translation that I've put together in order to help you see as closely as possible, if you can't read Greek, what the actual Greek text says. So verse 5, now some speaking about the temple, that beautiful stones and gifts it had been adorned with. So that's what's going on. Some were speaking about the temple or asking him, telling Jesus, pointing out to Jesus. They're talking about the temple, that lithos kalois, literally good or beautiful stones, and anathema it had been adorned with. What's interesting, anathema, this Ada right here, and it's only found once in the New Testament and then a number of times back in Leviticus. It talks about like votive offerings or dedicated offerings that are given to the temple in order to dedicate or to beautify, or that's the meaning it has here. But it's very close. Interestingly, if you switch this Ada with an epsilon, so anathema, not anathema, you would get the word for accursed, where we get anathema from. Like if anyone comes preaching another gospel, let him be anathema. So anathema is a bad thing. Anathema, a votive offering people give to beautify the temple. So it's important not to get those two mixed up because they have completely opposite meanings. But they were pointing out to Jesus the beautiful stones and the gifts that it had been adorned with. And he said, these that y'all, and I always translate the plural as y'all because I'm Southern and also because I want to make it clear he's talking to groups of people. These that y'all are seeing? The days are coming in which there will not be lithos epi litho, stone upon stone. We saw the significance of that in Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse. There will not be stone upon stone here that will not have been karaluthesetai, demolished or thrown down. So we don't know who. Now, in Matthew and Mark's version, it's the disciples, and they come to Jesus and they ask him later about all this. And they point out to him the buildings and the stones and everything. And he goes out of the temple over onto the Mount of Olives. And then they come to him in private, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and they ask him, when is this going to happen? And what will be the sign of your coming? That's how we saw in Mark's version. Matthew is a little bit different. But Luke has this all telescoped together as part of Jesus's teaching in the temple. So we don't know if it's in Luke's version. He doesn't say if it's his disciples. It's just some people. So they point out the beauty of the stones. Jesus says, you see all this? It's all coming down. And so they asked him, saying, Teacher, when therefore will these be? And what will be tasemeon, the sign when these are about to happen or about to be? So putting it here, kind of grouping it so you can see a little easier. There's 3 sections. People are talking about the temple, and they point out how beautiful it is, particularly the stones and the gifts that it's adorned with. So that's the first part. Jesus says it's all coming down, and then they ask him, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these are about to happen? So whenever you see in what's coming up in Luke's Olivet Discourse, these, tauta, these things, genesthai or geneo, the verb to be or to happen or to become, or specifically the verb coming, elusante, or hemere, days. So these are all key words. And if you watched our Mark Olivet Discourse series, then you've seen why these are keywords to keep in mind. But in Luke's version of the 3 versions of the Olivet Discourse, Luke's is the one that is the most clearly focused on the events of 70 AD. And this is from the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. In the entry about the Olivet Discourse, they say, since the influential 20th century work of Conzelman, the Gospel of Luke has been widely regarded as having de-apocalypticized, it's a fun word, the earlier Gospel material in order to deal with the problem of the delay of the parousia. So a number of scholars say Luke was written after 70 AD, which in and of itself, that's up for debate. I am not convinced of that position. I have yet to hear a good argument for why the book of Acts is not pre-70 AD and Luke's gospel is the prequel to the book of Acts. So I'm not convinced of that position, but most scholars probably are, and I get that. I readily concede that most scholars date Luke after the fall of Jerusalem. And so therefore, there's more of a separation in Luke, many scholars think, between the events of 70 AD and Jesus's teaching on numerous occasions throughout Luke, and even in the Olivet Discourse, to his return, to the parousia. So as people have said, it's because Luke is trying to de-apocalypticize, he's trying to disentangle 70 AD from the return of Jesus, because Luke was writing after 70 AD and we're like, yeah, Jesus hadn't returned. Jerusalem's already destroyed, the temple's destroyed, and Jesus is still not back. So Luke, in this view, is saying, well, we got to make it so that Jesus wasn't really saying that he was going to come back in 70 AD. If you watched our series on Mark and the Olivet Discourse, I think that's a wrong-headed approach to begin with. I don't think Jesus linked his return and 70 AD in the way that many just assume he did when they're reading these passages. But that's more than we want to get into now. It's just worth noting when you're comparing the different Olivet Discourses, some people think Luke's is the least apocalyptic compared to Mark's and Matthew's, or at least he has taken most of his apocalyptic material and put it in chapter 17, the little apocalypse, and so separated it from the Olivet Discourse. So just be aware of that. And then the difference, like we've mentioned, I. Howard Marshall notes the differences in the setting. In Mark, the disciples are outside the temple, and they comment on its exterior appearance. But in Luke, unnamed hearers, not the disciples necessarily, inside the temple comment on its internal decorations, those anathema. Luke does not have the shift of scene from the temple to the Mount of Olives found in Mark. Jesus leaves the temple and goes to the Mount of Olives and then gives the Olivet Discourse. He doesn't do that in Luke. And he does not restrict Jesus's audience to an inner group of disciples. It is public teaching which Jesus gives, and the warnings given to the disciples can also be heard with profit by the crowds. So in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, everybody hears what Jesus says. In Mark's version, the crowds and people near Jesus hear when he says it's all going to come down. But then when his disciples come to him later on the Mount of Olives, he gives them the Olivet Discourse. In Luke, it's all compacted together as part of Jesus's entering and exiting the temple every day and teaching in it. So Luke has sort of condensed or telescoped everything into this account that he's presenting. Now, let's talk about the temple, because Jesus says, you see all this? You know, they've said, oh, look at these beautiful stones and these gifts. And Jesus says, you see all this? Let me tell you, the days are coming. And he uses that phrase, the days are coming, when not one stone upon stone will be left undestroyed. So about the temple, Joel Green and a number of commentators, I'll share some of them insights, have pointed out the Jerusalem temple, admired by those with Jesus, was the project of Herod the Great, who in 2019 BC, so about 15 years before Jesus was born, depending on when you date the birth of Jesus, Herod the Great began building, adorning, beautifying, expanding the temple, the second temple, that essentially doubled its size and otherwise reflected his own aggrandizing character. He wasn't called Herod the Great for nothing. Pilgrims pouring into the city from the rustic environs of Palestine and the wider diaspora could not help but be impressed, even overwhelmed by its sheer size and magnificence, by the brilliance of the gold plates that covered its facade, and by the white marble that adorned its upper reaches. And Darrell Bock notes the same thing in his commentary. Started about 20 BC. It continued until AD 63 or 64. So this beautification of the temple took about 80 years in total. So when Jesus spoke in AD 33, the program was well underway. You know, it's like a generational project. It had been ongoing for about 40, 50 years at this point. Certainly a building so grand would have a long life. After all, it was decorated by gifts from many of the surrounding nations and was a building that had received notice around the Roman world. You know, even though Judea was a backwater province in the Roman Empire, the temple, Herod's temple, rightly should have been considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And that's exactly what Stein says in his commentary. Under Herod the Great, the temple experienced massive reconstruction, which began in 20 BC and continued until 63 AD. This new temple exceeded even Solomon's temple in beauty and size, and justifiably could have been included among the 7 wonders of the world. So the temple was today, there's the Dome of the Rock is there, and Al-Aqsa Mosque, and this whole section is the Temple Mount. This is where the temple was. This picture, I'm standing on the Mount of Olives in this picture. Actually, the Mount of Olives will be kind of more over here. I'm sort of towards Bethany in this picture. But all of this is the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley at Jerusalem. So this next illustration is from the opposite direction. So I would be standing like up here in this picture looking down. But this is what Herod's temple looked like when it was fully expanded. This is how Josephus describes the temple. As to the holy house itself, which was placed in the midst of the inmost court, that most sacred part of the temple, it was ascended to by 12 steps, and in front its height and its breadth were equal, each 100 cubits, though it was behind 40 cubits narrower. So the front, the facade, same height, same width, 100 cubits. And a cubit is from the tip of your finger to your elbow, about 1.5 feet, give or take. So think like 150 feet, which is enormous. For its front had what may be styled shoulders on each side that passed 20 cubits further. So it's like the front of the building, the facade was this big, impressive facade. And then behind those shoulders of the building was the actual building itself. Its first gate was 70 cubits high and 25 cubits broad. But this gate had no doors, for it represented the universal visibility of heaven, and that it cannot be excluded from any place. Its front was covered with gold all over, and through it the first part of the house that was more inward did all of it appear, which, as it was very large, so did all the parts about the more inward gate appear to shine to those who saw them. massive building covered in gold. Now, the outward face of the temple in its front wanted nothing that was likely to surprise either men's minds or their eyes. And that wanted, in this case, would probably mean lacking. It lacked nothing that would just blow you away. For it was covered all over the plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising of the sun reflected back a very fiery splendor, and made those who forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. This massive, shining, white marble, huge building overlaid with gold, with open gates, steps going up, gold and gifts and stones. I mean, this thing, it was mind-blowing in the ancient world. Here's a reconstruction of what it would have looked like, the whole Temple Mount with the fortress and the colonnade, and then all of the big open court, and then the temple itself, and then the city walls surrounding it. And so that when the sun hits it, all of this white marble and this brilliant gold, Josephus says, was blinding. So this is what this all would have looked like back then. Today, the remnants of it are the Temple Mount, the Wailing Wall. But just imagine this setting right here, and you're a pilgrim from Galilee, and you see this when you walk in there. You're used to living in a fishing village, maybe a small town. Maybe you have a couple of buildings in your town that are 2 stories. You may have seen a 3-story building somewhere in your life, and then you come to this. This is why, even centuries later in the Talmud, you would have this saying, he who has not seen the building, the Binyan, Herod's building, has never seen a glorious building in his life. So this is what, when the disciples or whoever, if it's the disciples or if it's someone in the crowd, this Tinon, whoever they are, when they talk about the beautiful stones and the gifts that adorn the temple, they're not just making chit chat. They have the correct response to this overwhelming physical beauty and majesty. Think of the most awe-inspiring building. Think of walking into St. Peter's or St. Paul's Cathedral. Think of looking up at the Burj Khalifa. Think about standing below the Eiffel Tower. Any of these massive building projects you can think of. Imagine that, and then multiply it exponentially. And that's what the disciples or the people in the crowd were pointing out to Jesus. And Jesus's response, absolutely scandalous. This thing that had been being built for decades, that was built by gifts given by godly people. This was the temple. This is where the Holy of Holies was. This is where the sacrifices took place. This is the center of everything about Israel. National, political, religious, ethnic identity, all of it culminated in this Jerusalem temple that Herod had been beautifying for decades, and his descendants after him. And about 50 years or so into its construction or its beautification, Jesus says, the days are coming, not one of these stones is going to be left on another. Just absolutely shocking. But there's more to it. And this is what we're going to look at in this video. The background. When Jesus says, Darrell Bock points this out in his commentary, when Jesus says the days will come or the days are coming, sometimes translated as the time will come, he uses the same phrases that Jeremiah used when he preached in the temple about the temple. So I've got on the screen here the Hebrew text. I've just pulled out the NIV here, the Septuagint, and then the New English translation of the Septuagint, just so I can track along. But we're going to spend time in Jeremiah in this episode because Jeremiah gives us incredibly important background for all of what Jesus is doing in Luke's gospel in the Olivet Discourse. So Jeremiah 7, this is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, and that verse is not in the Septuagint. Stand at the gates of the Lord's house and there proclaim this message. This is what God tells Jeremiah to say at the gates of the temple. Now, this is the first temple. This was Solomon's temple before it got destroyed and burned down and obliterated by Babylon. And then later, when it was rebuilt, then it got beautified and adorned and expanded by Herod, and that's the one that Jesus is in. So this is the temple 1.0. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. if you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known, and then come stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? Older translations might say den of thieves. This is the word. Here it is right here in Greek, leston. This is the word for brigands, robbers, bandits, we might say. And this is the exact word Jesus used when he cleanses the temple. And he rebukes, he says, my Father's house will be called a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of lestes, robbers, brigands, bandits. That's where he's getting this from. He's getting it from Jeremiah 7. But I've been watching, declares the Lord. Go now to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name. That's back when it was a tabernacle, not a temple, and it resided in Shiloh. God's saying, go back there and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not listen. I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh, I will now do to the house that bears my name, the temple you trust in, the place I've given to you and your ancestors. I will thrust you from my presence, just as I did all your fellow Israelites, the people of Ephraim. That's the northern kingdom that were dispersed, scattered into the nations. He's telling the southern kingdom, I'm going to do the same thing to you if you don't change your behavior. So do not pray for this people or offer any plea or petition for them. Do not plead with me, for I will not listen to you. God is telling Jeremiah the time for praying for this people is over. They are past the point of redemption. Do you not see what they're doing in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, the fathers light the fire, and the women knead the dough and make cakes to offer to the Queen of Heaven. They pour out drink offerings to other gods to arouse my anger. But am I the one they're provoking, declares the Lord? Are they not rather harming themselves to their own shame? In other words, their sin isn't harming me, it's harming them. And they're going to feel the consequences of it because they've broken my covenant. I'm removing my covenant protections, and that means that they are going to face destruction at the hands of the surrounding nations. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, my anger and my wrath, orge, the word for anger, and thumos, the word for wrath, will be poured out on this place. Remember this, my wrath poured out on this place. This is an important concept to keep in mind. On man and beast, on the trees of the field, and on the crops of your land, and it will burn and not be quenched. Another important point to keep in mind. Jeremiah was predicting that the Babylonians were going to come and destroy the temple and burn Jerusalem to the ground. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Go ahead, add your burnt offerings to your other sacrifices and eat the meat yourselves. For when I brought your ancestors out of Egypt and spoke to them, I didn't just give them commands about burnt offerings and sacrifices, but I gave them this command. Obey me, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. Walk in obedience to all I command you, that it may go well with you. But they did not listen or pay attention. Instead, they followed the stubborn inclinations of their evil hearts. They went backward, not forward. From the time your ancestors left Egypt until now, day after day, again and again, I sent you my servants, the prophets. I sent you my servant, the prophets. Jesus is going to have parables about someone sending servants to a disobedient city. But they did not listen to me or pay attention. They were stiff-necked and did more evil than their ancestors. Jesus is also going to have something to say about people who are stiff-necked and follow in the ways of their ancestors. When you tell them all this, they will not listen to you. When you call them, they will not answer. This is God telling Jeremiah. Therefore, say to them, this is the nation that has not obeyed the Lord its God or responded to correction. Truth has perished. It has vanished from their lips. Cut off your hair and throw it away. That's a sign of mourning. Take up a lament on the barren heights, for the Lord has rejected and abandoned this generation that is under his wrath. A very important concept to keep in mind. The people of Judah have done evil in my eyes, declares the Lord. They have set up their detestable idols in the house that bears my name. And this detestable idols is translating this, deligmata. We've seen this in Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse when we talked about the abomination that causes the beligma, that causes eremoseos, desolation. There's the word, the beligmata, detestable things, abominations, in the house that bears my name and have defiled it. They have built the high places of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom, otherwise known as the valley of Gehenna, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind. Gehenna, the valley of Ben Hinnom, is where child sacrifice even took place in Israel's downward slide into rampant idolatry. Verse 32, so beware, the days are coming, declares the Lord. And there it is right there, hemera echontai. This is the same verb that is in Luke's version, elusontai. So Jesus is echoing Jeremiah's sermon almost point for point, declares the Lord, when people will no longer call it Topheth or the valley of Ben Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they will bury the dead in Topheth until there's no more room. Then the carcasses of this people will become food for the birds and the wild animals, and there will be no one to frighten them away, the birds and the wild animals. I'll bring an end to the sounds of joy and gladness, to the voices of bride and bridegroom in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. For the land will become eremosen, desolate. And in the Septuagint, this is translated as is eremosen, to desolation or for desolation. Este will be pasa ege, all the earth or all the land. Ge can be land or earth. This is also going to be echoed in Luke's Olivet Discourse. In the context of Jeremiah, all the earth is referring to Jerusalem, the towns of Judah, the southern kingdom being destroyed at the hands of the Babylonians. Keep in mind, that's what the phrase originally meant. Pasa ege, being eremosen, all the land being made desolate. So this is Jeremiah 7. This is Jeremiah's temple sermon. And you can hear the echoes of what Jesus is saying in it. But Jeremiah's not done. In Jeremiah 22, we read, this is what the Lord says, go down to the palace of the king of Judah and proclaim this message there. So now the palace, which was by the temple in Jerusalem, this is the message Jeremiah is to proclaim. Hear the word of the Lord, you king of Judah who sit on David's throne, you, your officials, and the people who come through these gates. This is what the Lord says, do what is just and right. Rescue from the hand of the oppressor the one who has been robbed. Do no wrong or violence to the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place. For if you are careful to carry out these commands, then kings who sit on David's throne will come through the gates of this place, riding in chariots and on horses, accompanied by their officials and their people. That's what's supposed to happen. The kingly line of David would continue, culminating in the Messiah, if you do right. But, look at verse 5. If you do not obey these commands, declares the Lord, I swear by myself that this palace will become a ruin. And in the Septuagint, that is worded as, I swear by myself, says the Lord, that es eremosen, for desolation, este will be haoikas utos, this house. So Jeremiah 7, sermon against the temple. Jeremiah 22, sermon against the rulers of Jerusalem. And these are the rightful Davidic king that he's talking to. By the time of Jesus, there's no longer a Davidic king on the throne. It's an Idumean dynasty that Rome has put in place. So even less removed from the covenant promises that God gave Israel. And then Jeremiah 27, it doesn't work. The people don't listen. I mean, God told Jeremiah that they wouldn't listen, but he is still to preach to them as an indictment of their guilt. Jeremiah 27, early in the reign of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. This is what the Lord said to me. Make a yoke out of straps and crossbars and put it on your neck. Then send word to the kings of Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon through the envoys who have come to Jerusalem, to Zedekiah, king of Judah. Give them a message for their masters and say, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Tell this to your masters. So God giving a message to the envoys of these pagan kings. With my great power and outstretched arm, I made the earth and its people and the animals that are on it. and I give it to anyone I please. In other words, God is sovereign over everything. Now I will give all your countries into the hands of my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I will make even the wild animals subject to him. All nations will serve him and his son and his grandson until the time for his land comes. Then many nations and great kings will subjugate him. So God tells not just Israel, but the surrounding peoples who are also evil, Babylon is coming and you are all about to be put under his yoke. And then this verse is not in the Septuagint. You can see this verse is missing. In the Hebrew text, though, verse 7 says, all nations will serve him and his son and his grandson until the time comes, or until he comes, the time of his land. So this phrase, until the time of his land comes, the idea is Babylon is going to conquer and Babylon is going to rule everything until Babylon's time is up. The time of this nation, when it's up, then other kings will subjugate Babylon. And that's exactly what Persia did, and then Greece, and then Rome. So this idea of until the time of his land comes, we don't see how that would have been worded in Greek, which is unfortunate. It's not in the Greek text. So we don't know how it would have been worded exactly in Greek, whether it uses the same phrase when Jesus talks about Jerusalem being trampled by Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is complete. But the thought, the concept that Jesus is going to say in this discourse very much matches what Jeremiah was saying, that Babylon's going to reign until Babylon's time is up. And then it all happens in Jeremiah 52. On the 10th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard who served the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Temple, palace, city, destroyed by Babylon. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army under the commander of the imperial guard broke down all the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile some of the poorest people and those who remained in the city, along with the rest of the craftsmen and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But Nebuzaradan left behind the rest of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and the fields. And then it talks about what the Babylonians did, Jeremiah 52:17. They broke up the bronze pillars, movable stands, the bronze laver or the sea that were at the temple of the Lord, and carried all the bronze to Babylon. They took away then all these gold implements that were used in the temple, how much they were worth, how valuable they were. And then they took all of the chief priests and the rulers and the king's prisoner, brought him to the king of Babylon, had him executed there at Riblah, and then it lists the number of people carried off into exile. And 2 Kings 25 has the same account, but in the historical book. What does any of that wide detour we took back into Jeremiah have to do with the Olivet Discourse in Luke? Jesus is recapitulating what Jeremiah said in Jerusalem at the end, right before it fell to Babylon. Jesus is doing the same thing in the generation before Jerusalem is going to fall to the Babylon of his day, Rome. And just like Jerusalem in Jeremiah's day, it is going to be a judgment, God's wrath being poured out on God's own people, on the temple that bears his name, on the kings that rule in their palace in that temple, and on the city of Jerusalem. And just like what happened with Babylon, it's going to be a time of utter horror. And so Powell and Schnabel, in the New Testament use of the Old Testament commentary, they say, in view of Jesus' reference to Jeremiah's temple sermon, in which the prophet announces the destruction of the temple, see Jeremiah 7:22, the announcement in 21:6 that not one stone will be left clearly alludes to these oracles of the prophet that were fulfilled in the first destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. And that's the description that we saw in Jeremiah 52 and 2 Kings 25. And Nolan, in his commentary, points out something that shouldn't go unnoticed. First of all, he talks about the temple. He says, the grandeur of the temple, resplendent with the tributes offered in honor of God, should not lull people into feeling that all is well with God and the world. Indeed, all is not well, and the temple of which people were so proud is destined for the same fate as befell the temple of Jeremiah's day, a temple that had become a focus of false security before God among those whose lives failed to honor him. Jeremiah said, don't think you can live your life how you want and then run to the temple with your sacrifices and say, it's the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. God will protect us. God will never let his temple fall. Jeremiah said, no, he absolutely will let his temple fall. He will bring his wrath upon this building, and everything you see will be demolished. Fast forward a couple of centuries, Jesus is saying the same thing once again to the same city, the same temple, the leadership of that city and temple. They're going to meet the same fate. Only this time, it's not just one of the servants that God has sent to warn the people, like Jeremiah or Ezekiel, but it's his son, Jesus. And that's the point of Jesus's parable of the vineyard owner or of the landowner who goes away and sends representatives, and the wicked workers who reject them. And then finally, once he sent the son and they reject and kill the son and say, if we kill the heir and the landowner's off somewhere doing who knows what, then we can have this. That's the parable Jesus tells in and around this Olivet Discourse. We saw that in the first video in this series of Luke. But the detail that Nolan points out that's even more profound is Josephus linked the two destructions by maintaining that the fire of the temple in AD 70 had taken place on the same day of the year as the firing of the temple by the king of Babylon. See, in the biblical account, it talked about, on this day of this month, the king of Babylon set fire to the temple. Josephus points out that the Jerusalem temple was destroyed on that same day. He says, so Titus retired to the Tower of Antonia and resolved to storm the temple the next day early in the morning. Titus is the Roman general who's going to put down the insurrection, and with his whole army, and to encamp around about the holy house. Jesus is going to talk about when you see armies encamped around Jerusalem. But as for that house, God had for certain long ago doomed it to fire. And now that fatal day was come according to the revolution of ages. It was the 10th day of the month of Av, upon which it was formerly burnt by the king of Babylon, same day. Although these flames took their rise from the Jews themselves and were occasioned by them, for upon Titus's retiring, the seditious lay still for a little while and then attacked the Romans again. When those that guarded the holy house fought with those that quenched the fire that was burning in the inner court of the temple. But these Romans put the Jews to flight and proceeded as far as the holy house itself. At which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders and without any concern or dread upon him at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat out of the materials that were on fire. And being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window, through which there was a passage to the rooms that were round about the holy house on the north side of it. As the flames went upward, the Jews made a clamor, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. And now they spared not their lives any longer, nor suffered anything to restrain their force, since that holy house was perishing, for whose sake it was that they kept such a guard about it. So Josephus connects the dots as well, that the judgment that falls upon Jerusalem by Rome under Titus, 70 AD, is a recapitulation, another example of the same type of judgment that God unleashed on Jerusalem at the hands of Babylon in the 6th century. It's not just New Testament authors making this claim. This is what Jesus had said, and Josephus, likely unknowingly, backs it up. And so, coming full circle, Luke chapter 21 begins with Jesus pointing out that the lavish gifts that the rich people had given to the temple, they were nothing compared to the 2 little copper coins that the poor widow put into the treasury. That's what counted for more than all of the things that wowed and oohed and awed about the temple in the eyes of Jesus. And so Stein makes this observation: all too often one is enamored with the technical and artistic beauty of an object and is not aware of the spiritual poverty, blindness, and even evil that may underlie it. Jesus saw the latter and not so much the physical beauty of the temple. And in his understanding, the widow's 2 very small copper coins were more precious to God than all of this. That's the point of Luke setting the Olivet Discourse where he does, and putting that account of the woman and the 2 coins that she threw into the offering right at the beginning of Jesus's acknowledgement. And the crowds are just enamored by the beauty of the temple, and rightly so from an earthly perspective. But apocalyptic has a way of turning earthly perspective on its head. And through the eyes of heaven, that grandeur that Herod and his dynasty had spent decades constructing meant absolutely nothing. And there's 2 little copper coins that this poor widow put into the offering meant infinitely more. That's the type of God we serve. That's the type of Messiah Jesus is. all of the things we think we know about grandeur and political power and might and what keeps us safe, Jesus turns completely on its head. And he does it in exactly the same manner that the prophets in the Hebrew Bible did. Did you notice how many times Jeremiah linked God's judgment on the people with their treatment of the poor, the immigrant, the orphan? So, whenever you hear people talking about making a country great, remember in the eyes of God, what makes a country great is not its might, it's not its business acumen, it's not its economy, it's not its architectural achievements, it's certainly not its military might parading through the streets. God does not give a rip about any of that, and neither did Jesus. What matters in the eyes of the kingdom is how the subjects of the kingdom treat those all around them who bear the image of the king. That's the mark by which we're judged. And that's what Jesus was urgently trying to get Jerusalem of that generation to see. Just like Jeremiah, Jesus knew it was ultimately a lost cause. The majority in that city were not going to heed his message. His followers did, for the most part. If you watched our series here on Mark, we know that his followers were largely gone from the city by the time it fell. But those who did not heed the words of not just the ultimate prophet, but the Son of God himself, the Messiah of Israel, those who didn't heed his word ended up suffering the fate that he predicted, that he lamented. And the same is going to be true when the final day of the Lord comes. Remember, all these days of the Lord, whether it's Jerusalem's destruction at the hands of Babylon, whether it's Babylon being overthrown by the Persians, whether it's Jerusalem of Jesus's day being destroyed by Rome, whether it's the Roman Empire itself collapsing and being overthrown, any other subsequent empire throughout history, those are the day of the Lord for those people. And they will all culminate in a final day of the Lord, in which all of the wrongs will be made right, in which not just earthly empires, but death itself will be destroyed. And so the call of the Olivet Discourse is the same for every generation. Are you awake? Are you watching? Are you living a life that honors the King by honoring those who bear the image of the King? That's what matters to Jesus. So that'll do for this episode. We'll pick it back up in verse 8 in our next video. Stay tuned for that. If you haven't watched the Mark version of the Olivet Discourse here on the channel, again, tap the link below. Go through that study because we are building upon it. These are not one-off videos that you can just watch and have all of the necessary background. So follow along with the study. We'll be here when you get back, but that'll do for this episode. We'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo. In the meantime, as always, keep training.